Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had of course discussed this wonderful map of the world, the Kunyu Wangguo Quantu from 1602, which we were already familiar with from our slides. And last week, of course, we had finally looked at it in more detail. This wonderful product of cross-cultural Sino-Western collaboration between Matteo Ricci and a number of Jesuits and some Chinese collaborators. And we had said that this map really had been welcomed quite enthusiastically by the elites in Beijing. It had, of course, been presented to the imperial household, but especially pirated unofficial copies, circulated in Beijing and were quite a hot commodity. And I said that this really was a collaboration in that the Jesuits, of course, had very good knowledge of the world and its geography. And combined with, excellent Chinese printing technology, they were able to print this magnificent, huge map. And again, if you ever pass through the Twin Cities, please make sure to stop at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis and have a look at that map. Now today, we're going to look at some more examples of art. Chinese encounters with Western painting and the way the Chinese reacted to these paintings and to these encounters with Western art. Now during the late Ming, so that is the 1600s, 17th century. Remember that Matteo Ricci made that map in 1602. So those really the last decades of the Ming Dynasty. And then the early Qing Dynasty. So the Qing was the next big dynasty, another golden age in Chinese civilization, lasting from 1644 to 1912. It was also the last dynasty. So the Jesuits introduced Chinese to Western painting, especially Baroque painting or Baroque art. Art done in the Baroque style, Baroque techniques. And these Baroque techniques, were using perspective, chiaroscuro, which basically is the use of light, dark and light and shadows to express depth and distance, realist depiction, and very important, the use of oil. And none of that was really used much by Chinese painters. So, again, examples of Western art, whether it's devotional paintings, engravings, illustrated books, illusionistic paintings decorating some of the Jesuit churches, really piqued the curiosity among elites in Beijing, especially because these theories were so fundamentally different from Chinese aesthetics and the way the Chinese thought about art and what art should be doing. On the right you have an example, a very famous example of a Baroque painting, so a early 17th century painting that uses all those techniques. You have perspective, you have that use of light and dark, chiaroscuro, this very realist depiction, and of course these heavy oil paints. Now in China, painting really was quite different, and if you've seen Chinese paintings, if you've been to the San Francisco Asian Art Museum, you will know that Chinese painting, Chinese landscape painting especially, is actually quite different from European or Western painting. And one of the reasons is that in China, at least since the 10th or 11th century, painting in generally was not really meant to be a realistic depiction of the world, but rather an expression of the thoughts and feelings of an individual. Not so much, the realistic depiction of a landscape, but much more the kind of emotion that you experienced as you gazed at a landscape, right? All of that was going to be captured in a painting. And the Chinese in general considered the painstaking realism of the Jesuits or, European Baroque painting in general actually as inferior. And I'm quoting here a painter, intellectual from the 17th century Chinese, Wu Li. He says, "Our painting does not seek physical likeness and does not depend on fixed patterns. we call it, our paintings or our aesthetics, divine and untrammeled. Yi. And another literati, Zhou Yigui, he said, Westerners are skilled in geometry, and consequently there is not the slightest mistake in their way of rendering light and shade and distance, right? This is what I said about, depth and chiaroscuro. Yet they have no brush manner whatsoever. Although they possess skill, they are simply artisans, and their works cannot be considered true art. Note that there is a distinction being made here between art and artisanship, or skill, right? And I think this is really interesting. Definitely something we should discuss. Now, there is a perception then that Western art is lacking certain sublime, aesthetic, artistic qualities, and is quite inferior to Chinese painting. Now, what we will discuss today is that during the Qing Dynasty, when more and more Chinese, especially in the south of China, came into contact with more and more Western painting, they kind of started to challenge some of these views that really saw Western art as inferior, and probably sort of adopted a more transcultural, cross-cultural, maybe broader, maybe somewhat more tolerant view of art. And that's what, we are going to explore in this class. Now, here is a map of the Qing Dynasty. And, the Qing Dynasty, I already said, was another golden age of Chinese civilization. Under no other dynasty was the Chinese territory actually quite as big as then. So you see that all of, Central Asia, Mongolia, those territories that we've gotten to know as the Silk Road, all of that was part of the Qing Dynasty. And when I said that, especially Chinese in the south came to embrace Western art, I'm talking about these territories down here, right? Hong Kong, Macau. We've started to talk about Macau, where the Jesuits, of course, and the Portuguese had a base. Guangzhou, so these places where a lot of the trade, the overseas trade was conducted, and hence foreign products actually first would enter China. It is then also in Guangzhou, or Canton as it is often known in English, where during the Qing Dynasty in the 1750s, the Chinese emperor, the Kangxi emperor, granted licenses to a group of Chinese merchants, Canton merchants, to conduct trade with foreigners. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an entire session just dedicated to that trade, to the trade in Canton. So today, we're just going to mention this in passing. Now, for the next 100 years, from the 1750s to the 1850s, these merchants whom had gotten this license from the emperor to do this trade, they were also called Hong merchants, amassed immense wealth. This trade was really mutually beneficial. Foreigners got very wealthy, but the Chinese also got very wealthy. Trade, often, if it is conducted according to, to fair rules, is beneficial to both parties, should be beneficial to both parties. Now, while tea and raw silk were Canton's most lucrative exports, and if you've studied some Chinese history, you might have heard of the Opium Wars, and you might know that opium is probably its most infamous import, and again, we'll be talking more about that in a couple of weeks. Local elites started to develop a liking for certain European products, luxury items, such as clocks, mirrors, and art. Mostly art done in oil paintings, or behind glass paintings. And what is interesting is that very soon local Chinese artists actually began to merge Western and Chinese techniques to produce what is usually referred to as trade paintings. Paintings that were actually done in China that fused these Chinese and Western techniques, and many of them were then re-exported. But some of them were also locally consumed. And here on the left, you actually have examples of these trade paintings. These are paintings that were done in China, and you can see that, they don't quite look like Western paintings, but they certainly don't look like traditional Chinese paintings either. Now, beginning in the 17th century, European, mostly devotional, religious Baroque paintings arrived in China via, these Portuguese trading posts in Macau, and from there, made their way into China as far as Beijing, where of course the Jesuits ended up having a mission. Now, at the same time, several European painters actually visited or worked permanently in southern China a little later, in 18th and 19th century. And these include, for example, the official artist of Captain Cook's third voyage, John Webber. He stayed in Macau in 1777. Then there are a few others. Another very famous painter who lived actually in China for a longer period of time was George Chinnery. And he actually, there's a self-portrait of him here on the left, and he studied with a local Chinese artist. He studied Chinese techniques from him and taught him Western techniques in return. And at the bottom, you actually have a painting by George Chinnery, Sunset at Macau with fishermen and a bay beyond. So this is a painting he would have made in Macau. A painting that, without a doubt, Chinese painters, Chinese literati, maybe Chinese officials might have seen. And if they had seen it, what did they think? Well, fortunately, some of them told us what they thought. And they did so through what is called Ekphrastic Poetry. Poetry about paintings. And that is because in China, writing poetry was always a really, really important skill, activity that especially the literati, but just about anybody who was literate, practiced. So, especially government officials would write poetry, but also, religious figures or people just, even merchants if they had, a certain degree of education. So writing poetry was a very important pastime. And some of these men of letters wrote poems about these paintings that they saw. These ekphrastic poems then of mostly southern poets comment then on these unusual visual aesthetics of what they usually refer to as Western paintings or Yanghua. And some of them were actually from Europe. Some of them, as we already mentioned, were locally produced. And precisely because they were unfamiliar with the West's Renaissance or post-Renaissance techniques, these poets would express their anxiety, their distaste, their curiosity, their appreciation through very conventional poetic forms. So they would write, very traditional Chinese poems, but they would still sort of somehow expand their poetic horizons by talking about something very new. And what is sort of interesting is that these poems, in a way, can be read as a metaphor for how especially people in the South, southern elites, negotiated China's encounter with the West that really had commenced in earnest with the Portuguese arriving in Macau, with the Jesuits, and that of course would continue from here on. Before we go to our second course stream, I want to explain this week's forum assignment. So we are going to read a bunch of poems, ekphrastic poems, and our assignment is going to be a poetry response forum. So I posted an article to Ireland called Painted in Oil, Composed in Ink, and I want you to read the whole article, but you have to read particularly carefully pages 13 to 21, because that's where all the poems are. So, and then based on the chapter, what can you say about Chinese opinions about Western art in the 17th and 18th century? What would you say are the biggest differences between Chinese and Western aesthetic ideals? Please make sure to cite the chapter. And then, please choose at least one of the poems discussed on the pages 13 to 21, cite a couple of lines or a few lines, and explain in what way the poem engages with Western aesthetics. Does the poet like Western or Western-style paintings? If yes, which aspects? And why? And what does that tell us about changing views of the West in China? And finally, please engage with at least one of your peers. Write a comment or question. Maybe engage with a poem that you also find interesting. Let's see if we can have a little bit of dialogue this week in our forum. Everything's going to be due on Sunday, as always. Well, I look forward to reading your comments and your analysis of the poems, and I will see you shortly for our second course stream.